Okay, I'm good to go.
Okay, let's start. Danielle, thank you very much for having us here.
You're welcome.
The purpose we're coming here, we want to understand better about the Wenzhou immigration to Italy, to Prato, or to Florence, and to Italy in general.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to start this by asking you, so why did this Wenzhou people come to Italy, come to Prato?
Well, there are two reasons mainly. One is more of a historical reason. Italy was home to one of the earliest migrations from continental China to continental Europe. The first Zhejiang migrants that actually started that migration flow came over here in 1926. So from 1926 onwards to the Second World War, we already had a Chinese community in Italy that was entirely made of people from the Wenzhou area. And after the Second World War, there was a period where there was little migration from China elsewhere in the world. But in the 1980s, with the 改革开放, with the policy of opening up and development, we started having, again, migrants coming from the mountainous rural regions to the back of the port of Wenzhou. And these people came from the very same villages and the very same lineages that first had left China in the 1920s and 30s. So there are families here that are third, fourth, and even fifth generation migrants to Italy. So the second reason is mainly of an economic nature. At that time, Wenzhou was experiencing an unparalleled economic boom. But this boom only gave access to city jobs to people that were already connected with the city. And people that came from rural areas, they usually had not necessarily a very good deal when they moved to Wenzhou. They had to start from the very bottom, and it was very hard. So if some of these families had relatives abroad, they could choose to play that card. And this is what basically happened. Some people that had these foreign connections, that had these family members, these Italian uncles, they could ask them to help them leave China to move over to Italy. And that's where our newest migration flow actually started in the 1980s. And then it picked up its pace throughout the 1990s to reach basically a peak around the second half of the 2000s.
And then is this migration still continuing, or has gone
It is
flat?
continuing, but it's continuing at a slower pace. And the people who come to Italy now mainly come as family reunions. So it's wives or husbands of people that are already here, or they are children of people that are already here. And one of the reasons that we have less migration from China made out of workers that come to work in Italy is also tied to the laws and regulations that we have in place in Italy today, which are much more restrictive than what they used to be in the 1990s and 2000s. So that is also posing an obstacle. But on the other hand, I would say that the Wenzhou area today is fairly well off, and there is much less of a pressure to migrate.
Just wait 1 second, James. Okay.
So for the last few days, I was in Prato, and I met a lot of Wenzhou migrants, and I was told by them that now 25% of the population of Prato are Chinese, are mainly from Wenzhou. So that's about 50,000. So why?
That's excessive. It's not the right number.
Okay.
That's one thing you have to keep in mind. People tend to exaggerate these numbers in a big way. You have about 25 legal residents officially living in the Prato province. And if you count in people who are not residents, you probably reach about 30,000 people, which is pretty much the same number that we have in the province of Milan. It is true that they make up about 10% of the local resident population if you take the province as a number. If you talk about the municipality, then it's probably a little bit higher, but not 25%.
Okay.
You have 25 to 35 to even 50% in some select locations, like the Macrolotto, which is a very small district in Prato.
So let's put it this way: they have a. I think is it a fact to say that the highest percentage of the Chinese living in Europe that in Prato?
Probably that's probably correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what make those people just want to go Prato? Such a high percentage of people from Wenzhou want to go to Prato.
One thing that I often state is that Prato, to people like me that have been studying this migration for almost 30 years, Prato is the past, is not the future. Prato is the past of Chinese migration to Italy. It still holds dear to an economic insertion model that is dying out in all the rest of Italy, but it somehow still thrives in Prato. And it is fundamentally based in the garment trade, in the import of cheap textile products from China and some additional manufacturing in the factories in Prato in order to ship it then on to local markets in Italy and in other European countries. So what is called fast fashion. And the Wenzhou Chinese actually created fast fashion in Prato. Fast fashion is a new thing for Prato. This is not something that was there before the Chinese moved into the city, because the garment trade, the textile tradition in Prato was completely different. It was linked to textile production in terms of cloth, not necessarily clothes. Okay, there's a huge distinction there. And why do I say that it's the past? Because the factories that operate in Prato, they still operate according to the mainstays of Chinese immigrant entrepreneurship in the 1980s and 90s, which is very low profit margins, huge workload, extremely high compression of personal time and personal space. So it is a very hard way to make a living. You can make a profit, but you make a profit because of the volume of the trade you facilitate. And that is also an issue, because nowadays most of the garments that are being used and processed in Prato, of course they used to come from China, but nowadays you can have them cheaper from other parts of Asia. So this is making that model kind of obsolete, and younger generation migrants in Prato understand that and are trying to branch out into different kinds of enterprise.
It's great that actually you have explained the fast fashion and how it works in Prato. But I want to understand a bit in detail, in the sense that you mentioned the first significant wave of Wenzhou people moving to Prato was in the late 80s and early 90s. At the time, what drove them to want to come to
Well,
Prato?
at that time in Prato, you still had a garment industry that relied on a lot of work being made piecemeal at home by women, by Italian women. Okay, and when the Chinese started offering themselves as people that could do this kind of job at a higher, at lower price rates, but at faster speed, that prompted many Prato entrepreneurs to divert these piecemeal manufacturing from the locals to the Chinese. And the locals at first, of course, were not happy about this, but then they understood that they could still profit from this new development, because they could use their excess space, like warehouses or small factories or even small buildings, and rent them out to these Chinese, and so they would collect rent, and that would still be profitable to them. So during the 1980s and 90s, this system made, so to speak, everyone happy, because the Italians would collect rent or have workers doing the dirty work for them at a very convenient price, and at very fast work rates. And this changed when some Chinese entrepreneurs started understanding that they could go beyond this sweatshop model and do their own thing, and they started importing garments from China. That's when things started to sour in terms of ethnic relations in the Prato area. And that's basically what happened in the 2000s, when the fortunes of the Chinese in Prato grew, but the Italian textile manufacturing sector actually started to have its most difficult time ever. And this built up a lot of resentment towards the Chinese. So those were pretty hard times, especially the late 2000s, early 2010s. The situation that you are witnessing now in Prato is different, and it's probably a bit better because things have evened out a little bit. And also, some of the Chinese entrepreneurs are starting to understand that their business model had to change and had to become a little bit more inclusive because it's more profitable, first of all. And it's also probably better for the people working. You know, it makes for a better management of the work and leisure schedule, and so things are improving, I would say, in Prato.
So you mentioned that the Chinese came over and then they also learned the model and then they get into model, and I think what's the percentage of the Chinese owning those kind of fast fashion in Prato?
Today?
Yeah.
Oh, it's over 50%. I would say around 60%.
60%.
Yes.
And how many altogether? There, this kind of meal workshop?
Actually, let me correct that. It's from 50 to 60% garment manufacturing businesses. If we are talking strictly fast fashion, it's probably over 80%. Like the vast majority.
Then that's a percentage. And then do we have the figures of?
We have about 5,800 Chinese-run businesses in Prato.
Yeah, but that including restaurants and shops
exactly.
and things.
Of these, there are about 4,000 that are garment manufacturing businesses. You know, it's difficult to say because these numbers change pretty quickly. And the numbers I'm quoting now are from 2016. And in the past 2 years, there's been so many things, you know, including the trade war. So these things are having an impact. And nowadays, even in Prato, you have more and more Chinese entrepreneurs, Wenzhou entrepreneurs, branching out from the manufacturing sector and going into services, restaurants, shops, you name it.
And you said there are about 4,000 garment industry or business owned by the Chinese, but what's the total number of garment business in Prato? Do we have the figure?
I have to look it up. I don't have it right now in my head, but it's probably about 4 times that, I would say. So, you know, but you have to take into consideration that garment manufacturing in Prato is a big thing, and fast fashion is a part of it. But it's not all fast fashion, okay? And
now, as you said, that's for the fast fashion, that Chinese, they're 80%, you know, are belonged by Chinese. And then I can see, like, when we were wandering around the Prato and parts of, you know, the Chinatown, I feel like it's not an Italian town or city. It's more like I'm in Wenzhou. So does China's involvement, like Wenzhou people's involvement in Prato, bring any kind of social impact? And how do you view those impacts?